Hey everybody, today I just wanted to go through some of the early voting data we have so far in some of these key battleground states. You see on my map I've kind of laid out, and I've laid this out in a few of my videos, really the 9 key battlegrounds, and that doesn't mean that there are certainly others that can't go either direction, but these are the main 9 battleground states. And in this video, I just wanted to show where the early voting data stands in some of these battlegrounds where we have some good data to go through. And the ones that I've really found the best results in are Florida, North Carolina, and Nevada. And this is because a lot of the early voting data in the Rust Belt is just not very specific. They don't, in Michigan, for example, party data is just not there, and in a state like Pennsylvania they only have mail-in ballot data, not in-person early voting data on their Board of Elections website. So in the states of Florida, North Carolina, and Nevada, you're going to see some really good data out of those states, and we can sort of go through where the early vote stands right now and some of those early trends and in where they're coming from. So let's jump right into that, honestly. If we go into, I have Nevada here, but let's go to Florida first. Florida was a state that a few days ago had about a 300,000 vote lead for the Democrats. And one thing to, by the way, to point out is that just because we only have Democrats and Republicans in terms of we can only check out the vote in terms of party registration. That doesn't mean, of course, that all Republicans are voting for Donald Trump and all Democrats are voting for Joe Biden. But I do believe that the averages themselves will work themselves out, and you could take from this what you will. There's no hard and fast rule here. On the right side of the screen, there is the 2016 electoral map, just to give us a little bit of a grounds for comparison. But as you can see in Florida, it's a state that Donald Trump won by about 100,000, a little more than 100,000 votes. A state that he won with about 4.6 million votes to Hillary Clinton's 4.5. And right now we already see almost 3 million votes on either side. So we're getting very, very close. Total voted by percentage of registered voters, about 52%. So we're already about halfway through the registered voters, assuming, of course, not all registered voters are going to vote. So we're maybe 3/4 or at least close to 3/4 of the way through the entire electorate already in the state of Florida. And the Democrats, registered Democrats, have about a 4-point lead over registered Republicans. I'm sorry, about a 3-point lead over registered Republicans in Florida. And it's about a 200,000 vote lead. That's really what I'm looking at here, because that's, you expect, given the rhetoric and the polls taken on preferred method of voting, you imagine that the Democrats are more likely to vote in by mail, while more Republicans are going to vote in person and on election day. So you expect some of the ground to be made up. So a lead for the Democrats at this point in time is not out of the ordinary, or is not unusual, and I don't think anyone's reading too far into that right now. But you do want to look at what kind of a gap that is, because that's the gap that Republicans are going to have to make up as we near Election Day and get to Election Day. And this gap was about 300,000 a few days ago, so already a 100,000 vote gap being closed a bit. And here's why. Mail-in returns favored the Democrats by about 15 points here in terms of return rates. And as you can see, it's about a little bit more than a 600,000 vote lead for the Democrats in terms of just mail ballots returned. But then we go to in-person early votes, and we see that lead Now go to the Republicans, a 400,000 vote lead for the Republicans in terms of in-person early votes. So it does track with what we've seen, that the fact of the matter is more Democrats will vote by mail this election in most states, while most Republicans will prefer to vote in person. And I believe that will increase as we get closer to Election Day. The difference is, where is that gap going to get closed? And for some of that indication, we could actually go to the county map and see where most of these votes are coming from. And a lot of them have come from this area over here. And that's only because those are the highest counties by population. For example, where Joe Biden is going to find most of his support if he goes by the 2016 map is Miami-Dade County, Broward County, and Palm Beach County, those key three over here, where Hillary Clinton racked up the popular vote in Florida. And those states, and those counties rather, right now have about 50% of their registered voters already cast ballots. Now, on the other hand, for Donald Trump, you're going to notice the big difference with him, and especially the states of Florida and North Carolina, are these big states tend to be Democratic, where he'll pick off these little counties, these smaller counties. I keep calling them states, they're counties. He keeps picking off these smaller counties. See, he has a decent amount of support here in a bigger county of Polk, and Polk so far only 40% of the vote. So he could grab some support there. Where it's not as good news is he has a good amount of support coming out of Collier County, as well as a few in Monroe. But Collier County definitely more of a population in that county, and that county already has 66% of their votes cast. So at this point in the race in Florida especially, we're looking for how can the Republicans close the 200,000 vote gap, and we'll kind of look at that trend as we get close to Election Day. I'm sure it will narrow, and it's just finding counties left that have supported Trump in the past, and there's just a lot of them. So it's really difficult to take a look at each of these individually. Where I do want to take the look is in these bigger counties that went to Hillary Clinton, because that's going to indicate whether or not Joe Biden has tapped his resources already, and I don't see that right now. There's still a good amount of the vote left in these areas near Orlando, and about 50% more of an electorate here in Hillsborough County near Tampa. So it's not a lot of the vote, but you expect a lot of them voted early. And there's still just a lot of the vote left. Even though it doesn't look like that by percentage, there's a lot of the vote left in places like Broward and Miami-Dade, just because they are massive counties by population. So no real takeaway right now, except in Florida, the trend is tracking that Democrats are voting early by mail, while Republicans prefer in-person voting, and they are closing the gap in Florida. Polls are very, very tight right now in Florida, so again, you do want to see, if you're the Republicans, that vote narrow a little bit more as we get closer to Election Day, but the Democrats do have about a 200,000 vote lead so far by early voting. Going on to North Carolina, that's even more evident in North Carolina, where Donald Trump's support back in 2016 really came from those smaller counties, and that's even more to an extent in North Carolina than in Florida, because the main population in North Carolina comes from places around Charlotte, here as we see Mecklenburg County, and Wake County near Raleigh. So those two counties over there are a massive chunk of the vote, and both went decisively for Hillary Clinton back in 2016. Trump found his votes in these smaller counties, and they're a lot smaller than when we say smaller counties in Florida. So, again, something we can't really look at as much. So what we have to look at really are those big counties, and where does Joe Biden have his electorate left. And honestly, more than in Florida, we see that these counties are a little bit tapped. Again, Mecklenburg County near Charlotte is a massive county, and right now it's 53% of its electorate has already voted. And the same thing here when we go to Wake County, massive county, almost 60% of the vote already cast, or 60% of the electorate has already cast their votes. So that is a big deal for Donald Trump if he wants the state of North Carolina. The fact that there's not a lot more left in those huge Democratic counties in North Carolina. But where the bad news comes for the Trump campaign is the fact that right now, a lot of the vote right now is for the gap, at least, is for Joe Biden or the Democrats. And it's a lot farther than the gap in Florida. So if this gap was as close as in Florida, and you already tapped out those two main Democratic counties, you'd consider Trump in a really good spot here in North Carolina. However, the Democrats are currently leading in-person early voting by about 60,000 votes. But the big deal here is in returned mail-in ballots, where they lead by a little over 200,000 votes. So that's nearly a 300,000 vote lead so far for the Democrats in North Carolina. So that is a good margin. That is a good gap to have opened up if you're the Democrats. Now, again, they have tapped out some of their big Democratic counties, but it's still a big gap for Donald Trump to make up. And he'll be looking to close that gap as we get closer to Election Day. I don't think if you go into Election Day with a 300,000 vote deficit, you'll be able to make that up in these little counties of North Carolina. So I think that gap needs to be narrowed before Election Day if you're the Trump campaign. So a good spot right now for the Biden campaign, aside from the fact that his two big counties have pretty much been tapped. And the last one I want to look at, and it's a lot different than the last two we've looked at, and that's the state of Nevada, a state that Hillary Clinton won by a little over 20,000 votes back in 2016. So we don't have a map, nothing as pretty as Florida and North Carolina, but I did want to show it just to show it. Total vote right now has the Democrats leading by about 40,000. So again, that's a gap that's fairly significant in Nevada compared to the gaps in Florida and North Carolina, just because the population in Nevada is a lot lower. The in-person vote tracks with what we've been seeing, about a 60,000 vote lead for Republicans in in-person early voting, where there's about a 100,000 vote lead for Democrats in terms of mail-in voting. So again, I didn't want to really show much in Nevada. I just wanted to show that since we had the data, and it backs up a lot of what we've been seeing, as does the vote in Florida and North Carolina. And that's simply the fact that in those states, and I believe in other states, even though we can't really see it as well as in those three states, just because the data is not available in as crisp and clear a picture, and that's that the mail-in voting went early to the Democrats, and the Republicans have been able in these key states to chip away at that lead via in-person early voting. Now, the key for the Democrats is that they don't have a lot more to go when it comes to Election Day. So their get-out-the-vote effort on Election Day will be a lot simpler, because they'll just have to go after those that did not vote early or by mail and hopefully bring them out and, use that margin that they've already, that buffer that they've already created, and extend it. For the Republicans, on the other hand, you hope that the trends continue, that the in-person voting is what's driving the Republicans out, and you hope that that continues and comes in a big wave on election day. And right now, the trends are positive for the Republicans in terms of chipping away at that lead. However, will the lead in some of these states be too much to chip away in? You'll still need, I imagine, a wave of voters to come on election day, and there's no real way to say if they'll come until we get to election day. So that's what I wanted to point out with early voting. You could read into it if you want. I'm not, because there's just a lot more of the vote to be had in some of these key battleground states. And in this Rust Belt area especially, we don't know a lot except for mail-in. And if there's anything you can say about the mail-in vote, it is not indicative of what the final tallies will be, because Republicans, at least in states that we have the data, have made up that gap in in-person voting. So even though you can't see it, you imagine the same thing is happening in the Rust Belt. We don't know to what extent. We kind of have an idea of the extent here in the Sun Belt. So it really will come down to how many Republicans come out to vote on election day, and how big of a gap the Democrats will build with all the mail-in voting and early voting for that matter. So that's it for this one. I do have a final predictions video coming out, I think, on election day eve. So Monday, the 2nd of November, I think that's when I'll release it. We're getting close to that final day, that November 3rd election. So go out and vote. Subscribe, like this video. Thank you guys.